In the annals of Old West history, the topic of intertribal warfare is often overlooked. This is due to a variety of factors, not the least of which include both cultural biases and the lack of any substantive written record prior to European contact. However, tonight, we will be delving into a world seldom seen. A world that, though it had been influenced by New World trappings such as the horse and the firearm, still retained rivalries and blood feuds born long before contact with any European power had been made. This was war to the knife, with little to no concessions made for surrender or quarter of any kind. Long before the French, Spanish, English, or Dutch touched land on the North American continent, fights between tribes meant a win-or-die battle for all involved. Tonight, we take a look at one such fight between the Crow tribe and a group of Cheyenne warriors. The Bighorn Mountains, northern Wyoming, 1819. In the late summer sunshine, 32 Cheyenne warriors wearily led their ponies north through the mountains on their way back to their home territory after a visit with the longtime allies of theirs, the Arapaho. As they crested a pine-covered ridge, they came upon a Crow scout who, by the time they sighted him, was already attempting to make a desperate escape. The Crow and the Cheyenne had been long feuding, and this Crow scout had assuredly been sent out from a nearby village in order to keep tabs on the traveling party of Cheyenne. Unfortunately for that scout, this was a particularly unfortuitous meeting, as this group of Cheyenne were comprised mostly of what was known as dog soldiers or crooked lance soldiers. The latter name came from their weapon of choice, an 8 to 12 foot lance with a large shepherd's crook at the end. This could be used to run a buffalo or an enemy tribesman through, or to hook an opponent off their feet. However, for the dogmen, it had one additional use. A Cheyenne dogman was required to be an experienced warrior. He would then take an oath to the tribe to die rather than ever retreat in the face of the enemy. They were essentially the 300 Spartans of the Cheyenne tribe. Their lot was to fight or die, often done so with their lances staked into the ground, driven through a long sash connected to the warrior's bonnet. This was not only a symbolic gesture, but a literal restraint that forced the warrior to be true to his sacred word. These dog soldiers made quick work of running down the Crow scout and filling him with arrows. However, in spite of their tactical experience, they had made a critical error. The Crow scout had been part of a setup. Though he had been killed by the Cheyenne and thus now relegated to the realm of martyrdom and away from his terrestrial constraints as a tactical pawn, he had served his purpose well. His job was not to fight the Cheyenne and win on his own, but to draw them deeper into Crow territory, where his cohorts lay ready to spring an ambush. Though he was not able to draw the Cheyenne all the way into the waiting Crow envelopment, the killing of the Crow scout delayed them long enough that they were quickly set upon by a larger party of Crows. The Cheyenne quickly retreated to the top of the nearest hill, finding themselves surrounded on all sides, despite seizing the high ground. 3 other entire camps of Crow lay in wait all throughout the surrounding mountains, maintaining a perimeter of sorts to cut off any hope the Cheyenne may have had of escape. Survival, it was now obvious, was not an option. Soon the Cheyenne horses were all dead or dying, having been shot down by Crow arrows and bullets, or having had their throats slit by their owners rather than be surrendered to their enemy. The Cheyenne too began to fall, as many of them retreated to a small rocky outcropping not far from the summit of the hill. On the steep, rocky hillside, they would make their last stand. From here, with perhaps a dozen Cheyenne left alive, they peppered arrows down the hill as arrows and musket balls were lobbed up at them from seemingly all directions. One Crow made several good shots in a row and was quickly making an ascent up the hill towards the rocks, ducking and darting from behind one boulder to the next. One of the Cheyenne, possessing a rifle, a warrior named One-Eyed Antelope, spotted the Crow weaving his way towards their position. He patiently waited until the crow's head bobbed above another boulder, and then promptly blew his head off. The crow fell forward, splayed over a large rock. One-eyed Antelope began to sing and cry out. Then, having reloaded his rifle, still singing, he took aim and shot another crow warrior, killing him. Again, One-eyed Antelope sang and cried out, lauding his axe and encouraging his compatriots to fight on. 2 more crows would die before One-eyed Antelope himself was cut down by crow arrows. Soon, when the surviving Cheyenne were out of bullets and arrows, they were left with only the offensive use of their spears, knives, tomahawks, and clubs. The warriors sang their death songs as they made their final charge towards the crow lines, running down the hill, their weapons in hand, attempting to take any crow they could with them as they died. They were all shortly cut down by arrows, spears, bullets, and clubs. Then, they were all summarily mutilated, scalped, and left to be picked apart by the local scavenging wildlife. Anything of value on the bodies was taken, and then the crow knew all too well that it was time to pack up and move on quickly. They were a relatively small tribe, numbering perhaps a few thousand, and thus a comparative fraction of the size of the Cheyenne. Before the Dog Soldiers had ridden off in pursuit of the scout, they had sent a few younger warriors back as messengers to bring reinforcements. Eventually, those reinforcements would arrive, and as had been the case for time immemorial on the plains, vengeance was taken and many lives were lost. Eventually, though, after decades, the Cheyenne and Crow would reconcile their longtime differences and become friendly. When they recalled the story of this battle, the Crow spoke of how one warrior had sung his death song while cutting down 4 of their men in a row. It was only then that the family of One-eyed Antelope were able to find out what had really happened, when they were able to identify the Crow recreation of the song that was sung that day by some of the actual Crow warriors who had been there. One can only imagine how many thousands of times so many similar scenes went unrecorded and thus unregarded by the uninitiated that comprised the vast majority of Western society. Even in the 18th and 19th century, there was a tendency among those not living on the frontier to romanticize pre-European contact tribes as noble savages who had really attained a simultaneously simpler and more enlightened culture than the one that most living on America's eastern seaboard at the time had descended from. But ultimately, this was not reality. People are people, and the world, especially in the American West, was a harsh and unforgiving place. Life was short, brutal, and demanding. Conflict was constant. Resources were scarce, and people were willing to kill or die to ensure the security and survival of those they loved. We will never know how many hard battles were fought and hard deaths died far from the prying eyes and printing presses of Western civilization. However, luckily, there are a number of other accounts from not only the Cheyenne but other tribes that have passed down stories and recorded them via similar means, usually through passing them down verbally. We do know that the location was known from then on as Standing Crow Creek or Crow Standing Off Creek, either in reference to the Cheyenne standing off the Crow or to the Cheyenne crowing from their defenses after successfully killing their enemy combatants. The creek where the battle took place runs only miles away from where other famous battles, much more well known to history, like the Wagon Box Fight and the Fetterman Massacre, took place, decades later. The source for tonight's episode is My 9 Years Among the Indians by Herman Lehman. Link to purchase is in the description below. This is a first-hand account provided by an adopted Comanche warrior named Herman Lehman. We have done an episode on him previously, so if you'd like to know more about how Herman came to be with the Comanche, the episode to that is linked in the description below. 1878, Texas Hill Country. On a lazy, hot Texas afternoon, a band of Comanche had staked their sprawling camp near a creek that afforded some water and shade. They had been leisurely moving about the territory for a few weeks now, killing and eating what buffalo they could find, and killing a buffalo hunter here and there for fun. Earlier that day, 6 of their young braves had ventured off in search of game. All of a sudden, 3 of them appeared on the horizon. Now, not only were they 3 members short, before they were even able to broach the perimeter of the camp, they began to cry out the terrible news. The missing 3 braves had all been killed, cut down in a surprise attack by a roving band of about 30 Tonkawa warriors. The Tonkawa had long occupied central Texas, and had endured many hardships and much violence at the hand of the Comanche, as the Comanche had endured from them. Over the years, disdain had devolved into outright hatred, and atrocities on both sides were numerous and severe by any measure. The Comanche warriors, enraged at the murder of their friends and kinsmen, immediately grabbed their weapons and supplies, mounted their horses, and were off in pursuit. And after about 3 hours following the trail of the Tonkawa, they crested a ridge and came within sight of their camp. The Tonkawas, seemingly under the impression they had fled beyond the reasonable bounds of enemy pursuit, sat around a campfire waiting for their evening meal to cook. Then, for a fleeting moment, as the Comanche party came within sight of the Tonkawa, and the Tonkawa looked towards the top of the ridge that loomed over their camp and noticed their pursuers, there was a stark, terrifying silence. Then, the Comanche war chief gave a piercing war cry, and the band of Comanches swooped down into the ravine in which the Tonkawa were camped. Several Tonkawa were cut down in the camp, and the survivors fled deeper into the ravine. The Comanche now had possession of the camp. They scalped the Tonkawa who had been killed and began to ransack the possessions that had been left. Then, one warrior inspected the campfire that was still burning, with the Tonkawa's meal still sizzling. He shrieked out a war cry as he recognized the roasting meat that the Tonkawa had been preparing was a human leg. The Tonkawa practiced ritual cannibalism on all of their enemies, especially the hated Comanche, and this practice of imposed posthumous indignity ignited a unique ire within the Comanche. Now, killing their enemy alone would not do. The Comanche were determined to exact their pound of proverbial flesh and more. All present mounted again and took off down the ravine in hot pursuit of their quarry, now with their bloodlust unfettered. In the intervening time between their flight and the Comanche's gruesome discovery, the Tonkawa had constructed a defensive position deep in the ravine. From here, as they took on the initial Comanche charge, they managed to lay down a formidable amount of fire and fall several of their attackers. This managed to pause the Comanche onslaught. Then, a Tonkawa brave rode out of the ravine towards the Comanche. Raising his shield, he called out to them, challenging any among them to individual combat. One Comanche rode forward and was killed in hand-to-hand combat with the Tonkawa. Another charged forward and met the same fate. The Tonkawa believed eating the flesh of their enemy would imbue them with the desirable characteristics of that said fallen foe. The speculation in the Comanche ranks was that the taste of human flesh had made this Tonkawa particularly bold and powerful. Finally, a third Comanche managed to ride forward and dispatch him. At this point, the natural apprehension towards attacking an entrenched position gave way to collective rage. A war cry went up from the Comanches, who now sensed their prey within reach, and they made a final mad dash charge in which the remaining Tonkawas were either killed or mortally wounded in hand-to-hand combat. By the end of the fight, 8 more Comanche were killed and 40 to 50 more badly wounded. It had been a costly victory, but now the Comanche would truly exact their retribution. The following is Herman Lehman's personal account of the events that came next. A great many of the dying enemy were gasping for water, but we heeded not their pleadings. We scalped them, amputated their arms, cut off their legs, cut out their tongues, and threw their mangled bodies and limbs upon their own campfire, put on more brushwood, and piled the living, dying, and dead Tonkawas onto the fire. Some of them were able to flinch and work as a worm, and some were able to speak and plead for mercy. We piled them up, put on more wood, and danced around in great glee as we saw the grease and blood run from their bodies, and were delighted to see them swell up and hear the hide pop as it would burst in the fire. When all the Tonkawas had been consumed in the flames, the Comanche returned to their camp to find a scene of great sadness and despair. The wives of the slain men wept and moaned loudly and cut deep gashes into their arms, faces, and bodies. A somber and solemn funeral ritual was undertaken, and it would be 3 months more before the warriors would even attempt to raid again. After all the rage had settled, it seemed there was only endless amounts of pain and grief to be suffered. Though victory had gone to the Comanches, both sides were greatly impacted. Tonight's story is not to illustrate the particular culpability or competence of either side, but to give you a view into the world that is all too often misunderstood and ultimately underappreciated. There are thousands more tales of intertribal conflict, but for now, those are other stories for other times. On June 20th, 1837, William IV, King of England, died at the age of 71. His successor, Queen Victoria, would go on to reign for 63 years and 7 months, longer than any of her predecessors. The entire era of her reign would be known to history as the Victorian era. But that same month, 4,500 miles away, a group of young men gathered in a buffalo hide teepee in the middle of the night on the desolate, sweltering prairie. These young men were Cheyenne warriors, members of the Bowstring Society. They did not know, nor could they be bothered to care about the death of the King of England. Their concern as they gathered on that sweltering night was the stealing of horses. Or, perhaps more accurately, they were in a heated discussion about the decided lack of raiding they had been doing. These were young warriors, out to build their wealth and reputation. And the only way to do that in a culture such as the Cheyenne was raiding other tribes. Their intended target was an encampment of Kiowas, Comanches, and Lipan Apache who were encamped on the Texas Panhandle. Their Southern Plains counterparts, particularly the Kiowa and Comanche, were exponentially wealthier than they in terms of horse flesh. This, combined with the recent inability to get along between the Cheyenne and Kiowa, was the perfect pretense under which to launch a horse-stealing raid. However, they were being held back. White Thunder, the 70-year-old medicine man and elder known amongst this band of Cheyenne as the Keeper of the Arrows, would not allow it. There had been a murder amongst the Cheyenne, and no raids could be conducted until White Thunder, according to his position as Keeper of the Arrows, performed a cleansing ceremony. White Thunder insisted that not enough time had passed, not enough good signs had been accrued from the Great Spirit in order to justify the ceremony yet. But the young Cheyenne, members of one of the many martial societies among the Cheyenne known as the Bowstring Society, were militantly insistent. When White Thunder would not acquiesce to their verbal demands, they beat him with their quirts until he finally agreed, bruised and bloodied, to perform the ceremony. Once the ceremony was complete, the young warriors of the Bowstring Society began to outfit themselves for raiding and battle. But White Thunder warned them the coerced cleansing would not have the desired effect. The Bowstring warriors, young and haughty, paid him no mind. He was a foolish old man in their minds, too superstitious and self-important to be of any real use in their endeavors. But when they visited their neighbors and long-trusted allies, the Arapaho, they were shocked to find no takers on their offer to join the raiding party. The Arapaho were in the middle of their Sundance and warned their friends the Cheyenne that their medicine men had seen visions of great destruction and desolation for any warriors who attempted a raid at this cosmically inopportune time. But this all amounted to so much cowardice in the minds of the young Cheyenne warriors. They were fearless members of the Bowstring Society after all. They were not afraid of danger and would embrace it as a necessary means in garnering their ultimate ends. They, like young men everywhere throughout history, were willing to risk it all to acquire women, riches, and respect. And so, Against the wishes of their tribal elders, 38 of the Bowstring Society and 4 members of another Cheyenne warrior society known as the Contraries slipped out of their camp near the headwaters of the Arkansas River in the middle of the night and made their way south towards their intended target in what is today far northwest Texas. By the time they managed to come within striking distance of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan Apache camp, they were not so much the picture of fearless raiding warriors as they were exhausted, starving, and unnerved young men who were becoming increasingly ill at ease with the continued setbacks of their grand plans. Still determined not to return home empty-handed, they carried on with their plan of attack. They sent 2 scouts ahead of their main party to scout the Kiowa village. In another unfortuitous turn, the scouts ran into a young Kiowa who had wandered from the camp in search of good branches with which to construct arrows. Initially, the young boy thought they were returning Kiowa hunters and bid them hello from afar. The Cheyenne scouts shot arrows at him in response, but missed, and the boy was able to escape to the village and sound the alarm. Now, things had gone from bad to worse for the young Cheyenne warriors. They were rapidly turning from hunter to hunted, and with this unexpected turn and no solid, experienced leadership, they were unsure what to do. Within minutes, the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan braves of the village were fanning out in a large, armed, angry, and slightly confused search party. They would not have to search for long. The warriors of the Bowstring Society, low on arrows due to exhausting them in attempts to procure game, had quickly come to the realization that their miscalculations may have indeed been fatal. They had hastily constructed rock walls at the end of the ravine the creek ran into and draped thick buffalo hides over these in an attempt to provide themselves some sort of bulwark against the assault to come. With visions of returning home victorious horse barons now all but flickering memories, the warriors of the Bowstring Society were now faced with the stark reality of their situation. They could hear the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan coming, their horses' hoofbeats thundering up the ravine as their riders let out ever more vociferous war whoops. Then, the 2 parties were in sight of each other, and, all of a sudden, as murderous indignation met resolute defiance, there was awkward confusion. The Kiowa and their allies were unsure just exactly who they were trailing or what exactly was going on. Then they saw the hastily constructed breastworks and could only make out shadowy figures behind them. They called out and asked who these figures were and what they wanted in these lands. After a painfully pregnant pause, the young Cheyenne let loose their own war whoops, showing themselves and pounding their chests and dancing and singing their death songs. They shouted at the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan warriors present, daring their pursuers to come on. For the warriors of the Bowstring Society, there was nothing left to do but make one last desperate stand. And this they did. They fired off every arrow they had, then unsheathed their knives and tomahawks and took to vicious hand-to-hand combat. There was no concession in plains warfare, especially amongst grown men. Fights were to the death, and anyone who surrendered could expect only a longer, far more torturous demise. The Cheyenne managed to kill 6 more Kiowa in the vicious hand-to-hand fighting that followed, but eventually, before too long, every Cheyenne present, all 42 of them, lie dead in the bottom of that ravine in the most desolate reaches of the frontier. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan Apache would scalp all 42 and reportedly line all their bodies up along the walls of their impromptu defenses as a warning to any other prospective horse thieves. Years later, when a Kiowa named Stumbling Bear, who had been present that day, visited the site of the battle, he reported that all the skeletons still sat where they had left them, all in a row. It would be several months before the Cheyenne village would find out what happened to their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers. An Arapaho who had been at a nearby trading post heard the news from some Kiowas there and made his way back to the Cheyenne as fast as possible to let them know the terrible news. The grief and rage would tear through the Cheyenne camps like wildfire. They were incensed at the deaths and scalping of their kinsmen and compatriots, and determined to secure their revenge. This they would do a whole year later at a battle in northwest Oklahoma that would be one of the most terrible, most consequential intertribal conflicts between the largest tribes on the plains. October 1870, near present-day Saskatchewan, Alberta. A large party of Cree, Young Dogs, and Saulteaux had been making their way southeast for a few days. Anywhere from 600 to 800 strong, they were on the warpath in hopes of exacting revenge on their hated rivals, the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot had been wreaking havoc on the Cree for generations, but in the last few months had been particularly frequent in their raiding. However, these incessant minor raids were largely because the Blackfoot had been severely weakened by a smallpox outbreak over the last 2 years, and were having trouble securing resources via any more grandiose means. So, now, the chiefs of the Cree concluded that this would be a good time to make their assault. But, on this chilly morning in the middle of the Albertan plains, several dozen warriors stood in a semicircle around the war chief Piapo. Piapo had had a dream, and the dream had given him great concern about proceeding. As the impatient party of young warriors stood skeptically listening to his recounting of the dream, he beseeched them to proceed no farther on this raid. He proclaimed he had seen a giant buffalo with iron horns in his dream, and that this buffalo was attacking their entire camp, mauling and killing them wholesale with its giant iron horns. Understandably, Piapo thought this was not the kind of omen one wants to encounter while on the warpath. Still though, while dreams and visions did indeed hold great sway within the Cree tribe, this did not mean that all visions were created equal, nor that all were to be taken seriously. This party of bellicose young men were intent on exacting their revenge for horses stolen and family members killed. Thus, they were not terribly inclined to turn around and head home just because one of them had essentially had a bad dream. The party ignored his warnings, and they all carried on, southeast towards what is today known as the Oldman River, near present-day Lethbridge, Alberta. This is where the Blackfoot and their allies, the Bloods, were camped. Now, before we get too much further into this story, it's worth taking a moment to clarify the alliances between these different tribes that resulted in these deeply held and decades-long blood feuds. Like almost any other tribes cohabitating in a particular region, strategic alliances were often formed on Canada's harsh Central Plains as a means of survival. The Blackfoot were the largest contingent of the Blackfoot Confederacy. They were comprised of the Siksika, the Blackfoot, the Kainai, or the Blood, and two sections of the Piegan, or Piikani, the Northern Piikani and the Southern Piikani. Later on, they would be joined by the Sarsi and by the Gros Ventres. They spoke different languages, but adhered to a very similar culture. The Iron Confederacy was comprised of the Cree that moved onto the Great Plains around 1740. The southern half of this movement eventually became the Plains Cree, and the northern half would become the Woods Cree. The Saulteaux, which were the Plains Ojibwe, the Nakota or Stony people, also known as the Assiniboine, as well as the Métis and Haudenosaunee. As with most other conflicts amongst Plains tribes, theirs was a rivalry born of resources. The best hunting lands were held by those with the martial ability to acquire and sustain control of an area by running their enemies out, securing some form of peace agreement with them, or by killing them off entirely. In this case, the Blackfoot had long gotten the better of the Cree and their allies. But while the 1860s had certainly not been kind to the Cree and their allies in the Iron Confederacy, they presumed themselves to at least be in better shape than the Blackfoot by 1870. This had led this group of hundreds of warriors to believe that victory was all but guaranteed. Thus, the party carried on through the day until, as the sun began to sink into the eastern horizon, their scouts returned to report that they had found a few teepees at the base of a nearby hill, which were stragglers on their way to what the Cree believed to be the main Blackfoot campsite a short distance away. The decision was made to make a cold camp, no fires, and to wait the night out and attack in the pre-dawn hours. However, a fatal miscalculation had been made. Much like Custer and his men 6 years later at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Cree had vastly underestimated the totality of their opponent's force. Their scouts had been correct. There was indeed a small group of Bloods camped just up the river from the few teepees at the base of the hill. And if that was all there was, this would indeed be an easy route for the Cree. But, in fact, a far larger Blackfoot contingent was camped just up the river from this smaller group. Had the scouts seen this group, perhaps Chief Piapo's vision would have been given more credence at this most critical 11th hour. But they did not. And so, on the morning of October 25, 1870, before the sun had crested the skyline, the initial Cree attack began. The first to fall would be the two families that were camped at the bottom of the hill near the river. They awoke to their teepees being slit open by Cree knives. Everyone inside who was not shot dead with arrows or stabbed to death with spears where they lay was dragged outside and stabbed, slashed, and bludgeoned to death. This included a number of women and children. The next to fall would be the small group of Bloods camped next to the river, who were all asleep in their teepees. The Cree stormed into the camp, which was dead silent after they had killed all the dogs. The only thing that pierced the silence were the Cree yelling, "We're here," as they began slitting open teepees and slaughtering the inhabitants. Now the gunshots began to ring out, as the Bloods, whose camp was far better equipped with rifles and revolvers than their attackers, began to defend their families and their lives. Women and children shrieked in terror as they were cut down trying to cross the river in an attempt to flee to the larger Blackfoot camp. Many were shot down, some were not, and as they rushed into the larger camp to inform the Blackfoot leader, Mountain Chief, of the attack that was underway, they were met by warriors already exiting the camp on their way to defend their Blood allies. By the time the sun had risen, the river valley was swarming with Blackfoot warriors, riding at full speed on their war horses down the ridgeline and encircling the Cree near the river. Now, the hunters had become the hunted, and the Cree were forced to make a retreat. The fighting raged on for hours, with the Blackfoot and Cree ensconced in two ravines that ran parallel to one another. Attacks would be made and retreats attempted, with dozens of warriors on both sides being cut down by mid-afternoon. Eventually, hundreds of Cree warriors tried to swim back across the river and flee into the nearby thicket. But their attempt was spotted by a half-white, half-indigenous Blood scout named Jerry Potts, who was camped with the Blackfoot at the time. He alerted his cohorts to the fleeing body of Cree warriors, and he and the other Blackfoot lined the ridges around the river, shooting down at the mass of their fleeing prey. Potts recalled that the Cree were so thickly gathered and numerous that one could close their eyes and pull the trigger and still manage to kill one of them. Potts and his Blackfoot brethren killed all they could, including all of those who had been brave enough to stand on the shoreline and fight. The few dozen Cree who did make it across the river fled to the open prairie on the other side of the riverbank. The Blackfoot, having killed all the Cree they could at the river, harried their horses in pursuit of the remnants of their attackers' forces. They reached the Cree on the prairie, a few hundred yards from a small thicket. Here they cycloned around them, cutting them down in a running slaughter as the Cree made a desperate change of direction in an attempt to get to the nearby thicket. 50 of the several dozen were cut down before the very few remaining survivors reached the relative cover of the thicket. For what must have been a terrifying few minutes for those Cree warriors trapped in a thicket, the Blackfoot circled around them and shot at them, whooping and taunting the entire time. It must have seemed that a brutal death at the end of a Blackfoot spear or arrow was all but assured. But, as there were so few left, and they no longer posed any direct threat to the village, the Blackfoot let discretion be the better part of valor in this case, and left these few Cree in the thicket, on foot, to navigate their way home alone through the open prairies of Canada as winter set in. As the Blackfoot returned to their camp, the screams of their grieving wives, mothers, husbands, and fathers rang out everywhere. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, and the river itself ran red with the hundreds of gallons of human blood that now rushed into it from the dead and the dying. History would come to know this fight as the Battle of Belly River, and it would be the last and largest intertribal confrontation in Canadian history. But it certainly was not the only one. The tribes of the Northern Plains lived in an unforgiving reality. Their resources were finite, and territory was everything. And thus, as is universally the case with the human condition, conflicts inevitably arose. The source for tonight's episode is Warlords of Ancient Mexico: How the Mayans and Aztecs Ruled for More Than 1,000 Years, by Peter G. Soros. It is an in-depth view into this subject, and we highly recommend that you check it out. Link to purchases below, and now, on to tonight's episode. January 16, 378 AD. Smoking Frog, a Mayan war chief from the city of Teotihuacan in the Petén Valley region, sat at the front of a war canoe laden with weapons, dried fish, fruit, and additional supplies. Somewhere between 8 to 12 warriors acting under his command rode swiftly, silently, down what is now the Rio San Pedro in western central Mexico. Their intention was to capture the city of Tikal by any means necessary, kill the entire ruling family, and take control of the city themselves. These men, deftly cutting their way down the river through the pre-dawn darkness, were an elite expeditionary force of shock troops whose goal was to overrun the city, kill any and everyone they could until the royal family was captured, then to not only politically take over, but spiritually dominate the city by sacrificing the entire family in a violent blood ritual that would render their spiritual authority over the great metropolis invalid. At this point, it would be a fair question to ask why one city-state of the great Mayan Empire would be attacking another. The Mayan Empire functioned more like ancient Greece than ancient Rome, as there was no central emperor or single city that held primacy over the others. Rather, there was at best a synodal and at worst combative relationship between the numerous city-states that ruled over the various regions in central Mexico. Smoking Frog was a general in this elite force, serving under his ruler, the Teotihuacanos' king, Spear Thrower Owl. This fleet of war canoes had been on a relentless blitzkrieg attack for weeks now, and only a little over a week earlier had taken the town of Waka within a matter of hours. But their intended target, the culmination of their southward assault, was Tikal. The massive city, which was home to thousands of Mayan subjects, was ruled by the Emperor Jaguar Paw. But Jaguar Paw and the city-state had gotten out of hand in their aggressive expansion, at least by the measure of Spear Thrower Owl and his cohorts. Expansion in this case meant not only territory, but the building of spiritual power. For the Mayans, of any and all city-states within the overall empire, warfare was not only a terrestrial confrontation, but a metaphysical, spiritual one as well. Their warfare, which would ultimately evolve into what is today known as the Mayan Star Wars, were dependent entirely on divinations from their gods that were derived through a combination of celestial interpretations and blood ritual. When the time was right, according to these interpretations, the Mayan priests would pierce their tongues, lips, and genitals with the spines from stingrays, drawing them entirely through the wound and then catching the blood on a form of parchment they made from bark. This was then burned at a ceremonial altar. This was believed to be a portal to the world of the gods, through which signs could be clearly seen and directions or prophecies discerned. But to really open up the portal to the star gods, the Maya required blood sacrifice of a captured victim. And not just any victim, as not just any blood would do. Though sacrifice of common enemies would surely be pleasing to the star gods, only the sacrifice of royal blood could please them enough to open the celestial portal through which the gods might be directly contacted. For the Maya, this was a matter of life and death, a constant cosmic struggle to please insatiably bloodthirsty and uncompromising gods. Their religion was inseparable from the practicalities of their everyday life, and thus their entire existence depended on the blood sacrifice of the enemies they were able to capture. This is the reason Smoking Frog and his cohort of waterborne warriors were here. And now, as they came around a bend of the river and the smoke began to poke through the dense jungle canopy, the specter of Tikal loomed large in front of them. They carried large, circular, feather-rimmed discs emblazoned with the images of their gods into battle with them, believing that they were not mere representation of these deities, but the actual deities themselves now contained within that object and accompanying them into the fight. They also carried large manatee hide shields. These were also embedded with obsidian in traditional patterns. When the sun finally did rise, the obsidian flakes would gleam strikingly and terrifyingly in the morning glow. Though the Maya had no form of metal weapons, they carried swords crafted from local hardwoods that were shaped into clubs and then studded with obsidian spikes. Fastened to their belts were shorter daggers and quivers of darts that would be used in the reed blowguns they employed as a first offensive tactic. They carried short stabbing spears akin to wood and obsidian versions of the Ithwik, the short stabbing spears Shaka Zulu and his warriors would employ in their conquest of South Africa centuries later. They also carried throwing spears and atlatls, or spear throwers, which could be used to launch their projectile with magnitudes greater force than the human arm could muster alone. As they neared the city, Smoking Frog reminded his men of their intent and of the promises of the Serpent God that they would be victorious. They launched an offensive sortie of darts, arrows, and spears against the city's guards and easily overran the city's civilian population as they stormed their way to the royal palace. After killing the guards there, the royal family was captured, brought out, and according to the Mayan hieroglyphs that would later depict this event, were, quote, made to enter the water, a Mayan euphemism for death and ritual sacrifice. This meant that they were all stripped naked and held over a stone artifice or a rock as the Mayan priest present stabbed into their heaving torso with a jagged obsidian knife, reached into the cavity, grabbed the still beating heart, and ripped it out in one deft motion. The victim would then be decapitated and their heart burned on an altar as a means of opening that vaunted portal between this world and the next. The entire royal family of Tikal, including the king, queen, and children, would suffer this fate. It was believed the more they cried out in pain and fear, the greater the power of the connection to the gods would be. The stone hieroglyph does not depict that battle itself. That we must piece together from accounts of other Mayan raids. It simply shows the new ruler, Smoking Frog, adorned in the warrior headdress of a Teotihuacano, the equivalent of a British redcoat general storming the White House and taking over the presidency under the authority of King George. He wears a large feathered headdress under the symbol of an owl, which is believed to denote his position as a general of the Teotihuacano's king, spear thrower owl. What is certain is that this picture denotes a turning point in Mayan history, one in which the Star Wars would launch into full effect. The next centuries would be laden with countless intra- and intertribal raids that saw countless families broken, villages burned, and captives, men, women, and children alike, made to suffer horrific sacrificial deaths, all to serve an empire that ran on their very blood. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. But what do you think? Was Smoking Frog a good guy, a bad guy, or both? Was the Mayan Empire any better or worse than any other empire? Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the subscribe button, hit the like, share this episode with a friend, and if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking the join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.